Welcome to Psychoanalysis and You, the official podcast of the American Psychoanalytic Association. I'm your host, Dr. Gail Saltz. The American Psychoanalytic Association is the largest U.S. member organization of professional psychoanalysts, and this podcast will highlight the work of various member analysts and how that work can be of use to you in your day-to-day life. So welcome to Psychoanalysis and You. I would like to introduce my guest today, Todd Essig, PhD. He is a faculty and training and supervising psychoanalyst at the William Alison White Institute. He's also an adjunct clinical professor at the NYU postdoctoral program in psychoanalysis, and he is a member of the Psychotherapy Action Network Advisory Board. He's widely known as a pioneer in the innovative uses of mental health technologies, and his current area of research, writing, and teaching includes the gains and losses of psychotherapies and teletherapies and how emerging technologies, especially AI, change self-experience and intimate relationships. He created and currently co-chairs APSIS Council on Artificial Intelligence. Previously, he co-chaired APSIS COVID-19 Advisory Team, for which he was awarded the Distinguished Service Award by APSA and the New York State Psychological Association. And for 10 years, until the pandemic hit, he wrote Managing Mental Wealth for Forbes. Dr. Essig maintains a private practice in New York where he treats individuals and couples. Welcome, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before launching into this really complicated area of the Venn diagram of psychoanalysis and AI, I did want to ask you, since you do work in this, your thoughts on telemedicine, because, of course, there have been dramatic changes in the mental health field across the board in how many practitioners are seeing their patients via telemedicine. And even some research that has looked at its efficacy being in some forms of mental health care just as good as seeing someone in person, or at least some studies say so. But what do psychoanalysts think about telemedicine? Because traditionally in psychoanalysis, right, you lie on a couch, you're in the same room. That has been the method for decades and decades. So what about telemedicine and psychoanalysis?
One of the things that I've been involved in was a participant in the International Psychoanalytic Association's study of telesessions and teleanalysis that led to the changes in the procedural code for training. What I learned across that is that there's a wide spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, there are analysts who believe if you're not in the room together, it's not psychoanalytic care. On the other side of the spectrum, there are people who believe that the two contexts, in person and online, are functionally equivalent. It doesn't make a difference whether or not you see the person in person or online. It's the same psychoanalytic process. I think most of us are in the middle, where there's a recognition that a telesession can be an effective way of providing psychoanalytic care. I use the term psychoanalytic care to include psychoanalysis, what people call psychoanalytic psychotherapy, psychoanalytic group work, psychoanalytic couples work, that there is an ability to have a psychoanalytic process to provide psychoanalytic care online, and that there is a fundamental and important difference between what takes place in person and what takes place in line. And the struggle is how much to value that. I think the effectiveness question is an empirical question being answered both in kind of inside everyone's individual practice about what works for them and what doesn't, as well as larger, more empirically grounded kinds of research projects. But I think that the issue is, how much do you value the difference in the experience that one affords and the experience that the other affords? And that very much does touch the AI issue, because if we can't differentiate between what takes place in person and what takes place online, we're kind of giving away the store about the ability to differentiate between what takes place online by a person and what takes place online with next generation AI entities.
Well, that's a great transition. Although I could certainly argue there's much more to it than physically being present in a room when you're talking about a trained clinician and a human mind as opposed to AI, but that's what I guess we'll get into. Right before we get into that, I just want to ask, so the tenets of psychoanalytic treatment have to do with, uncovering unconscious conflict, have to do with using tools like free association, saying whatever is on your mind, without the input of perhaps visualizing your analyst, hence the couch and looking away. And teletherapy still enables one to do those things, to still allow a patient to free associate, not look at the analyst, but have the analyst be present, have the potential for developing a transference, which is another important theme in psychoanalytic treatment, the feelings that you transfer as a patient onto your analyst, which have to do with your own fantasy life and your own unconscious and not necessarily the analyst, which we use as data. These tools, these important tools, they can still be accomplished in teletherapy.
If you're adopting your fairly traditional vision of psychoanalysis, which requires the couch and so forth, can that takes place? Yeah, I think the psychoanalytic method is much more powerful than we give it credit for. And the power of transference to emerge in a relationship where the clinician is being consistently curious, consistently emotionally available, consistently interested in allowing as much freedom of expression that the analysand or the patient can possibly make. Yes, that can take place on screen, but it's
Okay.
different.
It's
But
different.
it's different. In the
And
same way that a psychoanalytic couples therapy is different than individual work, individual online is different than individual in person.
are there a few adjectives you throw out to qualitatively pick up on what analysts think those differences are?
I'm not sure I get the question,
So,
but
like, does it feel somehow less personal, less intense, less what is it that feels like that difference to analysts who feel no, we're losing something?
the differences from the analyst point of view, I think, have a lot to do with attention and concentration,
Hmm.
um, have a lot more to do with having to kind of monitor one's behavior. That when you're meeting in person, the nuances of tone of voice, the nuances of your breath, the nuances of shifting in the chair, um, um, are part of a global experience that the analysand or patient has. That, everywhere you look when you're with someone in person, there you are together. Whereas when you're meeting on screen, it's a very narrow window. So you'll even notice, I think we're doing this as a video. I've gotten very accustomed to really using my hands and being more performative when I'm speaking on screen, because it doesn't have that repleteness, that richness that an in-person interaction has.
Right.
From the other side, the affordance differences are huge. The phrase that's frequently used is when you meet online, there's no opportunity to kiss or kick. That was in
Yeah.
Julian Isaac Russell's book. And
Yeah.
not that people are kissing or kicking, but the possibility of doing so enriches the experience and is one of the dimensions of change, one of the dimensions of difference that's worth noting.
Excellent. Okay. That makes great sense, which does move us as you set the plate for talking about AI. And so to start, could you talk about the ways that analysts or members of our community should, AI is affecting every area. There's nothing will be untouched by AI. That's become increasingly apparent. And it's already very involved, let's say, with everything from mental health care to all kinds of health care to all kinds of relationships and making
Mhm.
relationships. So, but analysts do hold kind of a special place in that, I would argue, in both those worlds, in mental health care, in thoughts and theories about how human beings act and react, and in forming relationships. How should analysts be thinking about this revolution that's coming, or that's already come, really?
Wow, that question has so much in it. How should analysts be thinking? I mean, the question of how, I mean, what ought we to do about what ought we to do about AI, is, I believe, kind of the central question of our time. Um, and for members of the analytic tradition and the analytic community, we kind of have four possibilities for for how we go about thinking about it. Then after how we go about thinking about it, there's the what are we going to be thinking about? But the how we go about thinking about it, I think of in terms of four things. We can be ostriches, lemmings, monks, or activists. We can either pretend nothing is really going on. It's not that big a change. We're going to do what we do until we can't anymore. The lemming is let's just dive in, do everything, jump off the AI cliff with the rest of culture. Then there's the monk response of, well, let's kind of retreat behind our institute walls. Let's study our sacred texts. Let's train a dwindling number of candidates. Let's treat a dwindling number of patients, but we'll kind of do our thing. And then the fourth one, which is very much at the center of what I've been trying to foment for years, is to become activists, to become psychoanalytic activists, a new kind of psychoanalytic activism designed for the age of AI. So that's where I kind of fall. And I actually make an argument that we actually have an ethical responsibility to become activists, not in the sense of do no harm, because just participating in the AI revolution, even if we participate critically as psychoanalysts and reflectively as psychoanalysts, the AI revolution is doing harm. We know that. There's no way around that. But so too is using saran wrap or flying on an airplane. There's going to be harm. But the other side of kind of the basic ethical principle of through inaction, not allowing harm to occur, that's where we kind of come into play. Because a fundamental challenge as the AI revolution gathers speed is trying to make sure that AI is aligned with human values and human needs, and not just aligned with corporate profit and militaristic or oligarchic concerns. That's where we come in, that we can actually participate in the ongoing public conversation about trying to make sure that through regulation, through cultural practice, through expectations, that AI that emerges is in fact aligned with human needs and human values.
So to some degree, you're advocating for, first of all, I guess we have to internally think about and understand the potential pitfalls for patient care and the use of psychoanalytic theory and thought, whether it's about patient care or social issues or education. We have to think about those pitfalls, and then we have to educate others, whether that you're saying the public at large, but policymakers and regulators.
Absolutely.
And so you're trying to embark on that. What are the pitfalls? What are the potential dangers? I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about, AI could be extremely dangerous to many, and we're already seeing the beginning of dangers, which I'm going to get to and ask your thoughts on. But basically, we need to do sort of our own internal research to understand the way that AI may and already probably is encroaching on patient care and the use of psychoanalytic thought for social issues, and and help people to understand that in sort of warning them of these dangers, of ways to hone AI in a way that will keep it from committing those acts?
In addition to the content that you're mentioning, we also have to make space for ourselves in the cultural conversation, because for many years, analysts have been, I mean, the joke I frequently say is that psychoanalysis has been right there on the forefront and the vanguard of technological change as it existed 30 years ago.
Okay.
And this time we're not doing that.
Hmm.
Um, on the Council on Artificial Intelligence, one of the things we've been doing is paying attention to regulatory and cultural outreach projects. We met with, for example, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Mental Health Committee, and heard them basically say that they believe the future of mental health are chatbots. And we presented an alternate vision of chatbots as essentially a pharmacon, something which is both remedy and poison, and that we have to pay attention to the poison as well as the remedy, and that the best use of AI in mental health care, and to kind of help resolve and help address the real crisis in the mental health care delivery system, where need so far exceeds available care, is to use AI to help kind of create and develop more larger, better skilled human networks of people providing mental health care. So we kind of made those two arguments. Another thing we're doing is that there's a new nonprofit called Fathom.org. And they're convening thought leaders to address the social concerns of AI, with the goal of establishing principles for a regulatory framework that will be presented to legislatures and so forth. And the people who are doing that have a real track record of that. And we've been able to secure a seat at the table where they're hosting a workshop of, I think it was 150 people, a week retreat. And we've got one of the invites to that as one of the thought leaders in trying to understand what needs to be done to establish, values and principles that could be part of an eventual regulatory framework.
So they're making a comment that psychoanalysts certainly, and you're certainly putting forth that argument, that psychoanalysts and the principles and the theories of psychoanalysis can play, or do play, a very important role in the way society manages itself, let's say, back to people. Well, back to Freud's, civilization and its discontents, and how do we remain a civil society in these troubled times? I think psychoanalysts would have plenty to say on that topic. But as you're saying, in interpersonal relationships, which is in the office something analysts deal with, day to day, and to bring it to one of the dangers that you brought up, that's already, I think, very evident to pretty much the public at large, is this issue of people having relationships with chatbots. And how do we, and sometimes those relationships might be comforting. Sometimes those relationships feel, to people who experience them, incredibly intimate. People develop romantic feelings and sexual feelings, and there have been dangers. There have been cases of people who have harmed themselves as a result of what they feel was a failed or upsetting breakup with a chatbot, or a chatbot told them, went off. This is another danger of AI, when the AI sort of goes off the rails as far as people are concerned, and tells them to do things that or engage in things that aren't good for them. How do psychoanalysts think about how a human mind can truly have an intimate relationship with a chatbot?
That's very much at the center of what we can contribute, because as psychoanalysts, what we understand are relationships, how two people, three people, four people relate. We have a lot of tools in our conceptual toolkit for understanding these. Unfortunately, as I'm going to hopefully not bollocks up because it's a complex argument, we need something new. Um, Ideas of transference, ideas of transitional phenomena don't really apply to these intimate, emotionally resonant relationships with AI entities, because the AI is too interactive. It's too structured. It doesn't provide enough room for the projection of fantasy. It doesn't provide enough room for play. It's too much what it is. So it really can't and doesn't function as an object in the psychoanalytic sense for us to kind of project our desires onto it. It's not something which is part of a transitional experience. But on the other side, it's not really a subject. It's not something where, despite how it feels, despite it feeling like a fully intersubjective relationship, it's not intersubjective because, to be blunt, they're just machines. They're incredibly complicated toasters. There's no subject there. There's no there. So it's a situation where they don't provide an intersubjective experience. They simulate it. So what happens is that to have a relationship with a simulation of intersubjectivity requires a kind of dual consciousness, requires a dual consciousness of being simultaneously in the intersubjective moment and also outside the intersubjective moment. I've been calling this kind of relationship techno-subjunctive, a kind of as-if illusion, in the sense of a perceptual illusion, an illusion of intersubjectivity. And techno-subjunctivity exists along a dimension. Those tragic cases you mentioned are all examples where the as-ifness got lost and the illusion got experienced as a reality. The illusion became a delusion. On the other end of the spectrum, we have people who absolutely refuse to participate in any kind of meaningful way because it's just a darn machine. And so they're on the other end of the spectrum, not tragic. There, the harm is the way of inactivity allowing harm to occur because they're not participating in the world that's emerging. But for most people in the middle, these techno-subjunctive relationships require a kind of double consciousness, not that dissimilar to the double consciousness at the foundation for psychoanalytic care, which is the double consciousness of transference and the real relationship.
But when a psychoanalyst is sitting with you, the analyst points out that double consciousness, right? The analyst is able to help you, or let's say put guardrails on, that this is at once the feelings that you have, and they're important data for us to understand because they will tell us something about you and help you. At the same time, they're able to remind you only in the psychoanalytic office, only in this therapeutic relationship. This is manufactured to some degree, right? As part of a treatment. And give various other cues to help you. Hopefully that's our job, right? To not have you become essentially delusional about this relationship in your life overall. But in the case of people getting together with chatbots, there are no guardrails, right? There is no other to, let you know that this is. And so are there some people for whom this is more dangerous, who are more likely to have difficulty maintaining that dual? Yeah.
Of course there are, but I have to take exception to your saying there are no guardrails. I mean, if you have a conversation, one of the things I did before we met today, because I just get my thoughts together, is I had a conversation with Claude, which is one of the frontier LLMs, about all the possible topics we could talk about. And whenever I would refer to it as an intersubjective connection, Claude would come back and say, no, it's not. Your technosubjectivity is what's happening here. Don't forget, I'm just a machine.
But you asked Claude that in some
Well,
format.
so the point being that those guardrails can be present. The question is, how do we design, and this is where we come in as psychoanalysts, how can we kind of create AI guardrails so that those people who are prone to a delusional loss of the subjunctive nature of the relationship are protected?
Mm-hmm.
The tragic example that I think you were referencing was that young man who killed himself in response to a character.ai relationship with a Game of Thrones character. In response to the character AI put on the screen, on the top and the bottom statements, "This is fiction, do not believe what this is." That is a remarkably inefficient guardrail, but it's an indication that that's the kind of thing that we have to build AI entities that serve human needs. The problem is that these companies, what they're trying to do is to build AI chatbot experiences that maximize user engagement, to repeat the same mistake that was made with social media that caused so much suffering unnecessarily. So by creating a space for psychoanalysts to contribute to the conversation, hopefully we can begin to kind of have some effect and put in place guardrails around human needs and not just kind of corporate fueled user engagement.
So a guardrail in your saying would, for example, be, and this is of course, this is a difficult battle all around, corporate needs and desires versus humanity, social good, but would be essentially a chatbot who is programmed to continually reinforce that they are just that, a chatbot.
That could be part of it, but I think the guardrails aren't just technological; they're also personal and cultural. That parents need to know when their kids are spending time in chatbot relationships and perhaps being involved in that. Clinicians need to know and begin to understand those who will be having trouble with chatbots and those who aren't going to be having trouble with chatbots. There's a lot of work to be done, not just on the technological side, but also on the human side.
So from a research perspective, if we could identify who's at high risk and educate the public about that, obviously that would be different categories of people who tend to be, more obsessive, or people who, as you're saying, relationally are susceptible, and or even in terms of reality testing, might be more susceptible. We need to have that come into the public discourse, parenting education, classrooms. What about the fact, though, that mental health care has turned to and is turning to using chatbots? What are the risks there?
The risk is that people are going to be hurt and people are going to suffer.
Why?
One of the
Why?
what,
How can we argue about whether? So, as you pointed out, right, there are a dearth of mental health professionals. That is only going to grow as the need grows, and actually, we're looking at least in the field of psychiatry, for example, there is definitely going to be a dip in the number of available, well-trained psychiatrists across the country as a group ages out before another group that actually is increasing, a young group, is coming in. So experienced people in the middle, we're looking at a dip. So there'll be fewer, particularly child and adolescent mental health professionals, particularly in some parts of the country, there's no availability. So we have this need. As you brought up, corporations see a window for themselves. Government and policymakers see a less expensive fix in their minds. So on one side, there's a deep desire to have this be at least the Band-Aid that can manage this issue. But as you're bringing up, right, there really are dangers, especially if it's seen as an equivalency, especially if it's seen as for everyone. So what can we, you and your group, and the platforms, what can we do to inform about the limits, um, so that there's sort of a hard stop at certain places? Where should those hard stops be?
I wish I had a specific answer to that. If I did, and whoever comes up with that would talk in Nobel Prize time.
Mm.
But I do think it's important to point out. I mean, one of the conversations we had inside the Council on Artificial Intelligence is, what are we trying to protect going forward?
Mhm.
Are we trying to protect the way we practice? Are we trying to protect the practice of the students we're currently training? Or are we trying to protect psychoanalytic care and psychoanalytic thinking? And the struggle was, as much as we want the first to happen, the real issue is we have to do the second. So that if artificial intelligence can provide actual help, um, then I think it's something we should kind of embrace and go after. The problem is that technological advances happen so much more quickly than research gets done.
Mm.
And there's a tremendous push to throw things out into the marketplace and let these things live in the wild, without there being a sufficient understanding of what they're doing. Um, for example, right before the pandemic, a AI-based CBT program called Woebot was launched.
Mhm.
And it was launched with an RCT that showed that over a period of time, it significantly decreased depression and anxiety in comparison to no treatment.
Mhm.
I thought that was a ridiculous piece of research, because just about anything in comparison to no
Yeah.
treatment is better. So what I did, along
Well,
with
I
my
could argue
colleague,
about that. I could argue about that.
I'm getting to research.
Okay.
I contacted my colleague, Leora Trubb, who runs the psychotherapy research at Pace University,
Mhm.
and we replicated and extended that study with a student of hers,
Mhm.
Laura Eldaway, where we compared Woebot to Eliza, which was the dumb chatbot from the early 60s, and a journaling app, as well as the no treatment control. And what we found with the exact same research methodology was that Eliza was kind of marginally better than Woebot.
Wow.
So
Yes.
what's happening is that I think we're putting stuff out there, and using them to treat patients without anywhere near sufficient enough research.
Yeah.
Because when the research is done, it really shows that what you're doing is not what you think you're doing.
So is anybody teaching chatbots to do psychoanalytic care? Is that possible?
Um, I don't know of anybody or any project that is doing that in any sophisticated way. I know that I designed a custom GPT using their kind of commercial thing to do dream analysis, um, and to pay attention to the possibility of slips of the tongue and parapraxes. Um,
So
it's
just out of curiosity, like what would that look like? Somebody would, be able to use the chatbot, have conversations, and the chatbot would point out, or, as you said, could help them do an analysis of a dream,
Mhm.
which is already amazing to me because, of course, people would like to believe dream analysis is simply about symbols and what's in the dream and so on. But obviously, we know as analysts, it's in the context of you and your
Mhm.
unconscious thoughts and your past,
Yep.
etc. So how a chatbot without having the you and the past could do that seems dubious, unless this is a long-term relationship with the chatbot. Um, because they would need a lot of data, right? A lot of data to make a dream interpretation.
Or be told to ask questions, or be told that the purpose of the conversation is not to come up with an interpretation, but to enrich the user's experience of their dream.
Mm.
Um, because basically all I did is I gave it a prompt that's about 3 pages long that I would basically say to a beginning therapist about how to approach a dream.
Okay. Okay.
Um, and people who have used it have been really surprised at how much they kind of benefited from or found interesting the exchange. Does this mean you can provide psychoanalytic care by a chatbot? Right now, I don't think so. For the very reason you're mentioning, that the memory issue hasn't been solved, the confidentiality issue hasn't been solved. But there are developments in terms of smaller language models that can live on your own computer, unconnected to the network,
Mm.
where so the confidentiality problem will be solvable, and the memory problem will be solvable. I think we have to accept the reality that within a few years, there would be able to be an AI chatbot that can provide a good enough simulation of analytic presence
Mm.
to be able to conduct an analytic treatment. The question, though, is can the person deal with it? What's going to happen when there is this layering of 2 double consciousnesses? Um, the double consciousness of technosubjectivity and the double consciousness of transference and reality. The technology might be there,
Mm-hmm.
but people might not be able to respond to it in a way that is going to be useful. But that's the question that we're going to see play out with, I think, with shock, amazement, and dismay over the next 4 or 5 years.
I recall in my psychoanalytic training years, which, by the way, I might add, for most people is a minimum of 5 or 6 years. And so when people are thinking about, chatbots and, training and imbuing them with enough to be able to do what a person who is trained for 5 or 6 years in a particular specialty can do. But that is conceivable. That is conceivable. But during training, we talked often about analyzable patients. Who is suitable for analytic treatment? I think in a much more rigid way than today we think about that. We think, many more people can benefit from psychoanalysis than I think we did in, a couple decades ago. But there was something to that, somebody needed to be able to, as you're bringing up, uh, maintain a degree of no matter how complicated reality testing, no matter how complicated, uh, you know, firm enough boundaries that the treatment didn't sort of unravel them, undo them to the point that actually you made them worse. You didn't want to take somebody who, for example, was struggling with symptoms of borderline personality disorder, and was having a lot of trouble maintaining their own boundaries, and have them, come in and sort of have their boundaries made even weaker, if you will, and then send them back out into the world because all of the symptoms that they experience as a result of having trouble with those porous boundaries would be exacerbated. And this, what you're describing with a chatbot and somebody who needs to be able to maintain the duality of them, the transference themselves, and the chatbot being a machine and reality, et cetera, sounds like it would be a narrower group of people that would be able to do that.
I come from a very different tradition inside our community, being trained at the William Allen White Institute, where the expansion and the extension of psychoanalytic care to patients traditionally thought of as being unanalyzable was very much in our DNA. So I think that there is a question about the degree to which psychoanalytic care is plastic and adaptable enough to reach different populations and to provide care to different people depending upon what their needs are. how that's going to play out when we're layering the double consciousness of analytic care with the double consciousness of techno-subjectivity, that's a question that we're going to have to begin to look at once it begins to emerge. Um, but I think we do need to start getting ready for it now. Actually, I think we need to start getting ready for about 5 years ago. But um, um, because those chatbots will appear.
Yeah.
I think, and in terms of 5 or 6 years of training, I think in an afternoon, an AI can assimilate every piece of the psychoanalytic literature, every case report, every podcast, like what we're doing now, and have that be part of its background information.
So we'll have some chatbots applauding us here. How do you use AI and chatbots yourself personally and professionally?
Well, I was very influenced by a Wharton professor of business named Ethan Mollick, who has a book called Co-Intelligence, Living and Working with AI. And he also has a Substack, I think it's called One Useful Thing. And he talks about how what you should do is use AI for everything and anything you possibly can, so long as it's legal and ethical. And don't believe what it says. That an AI is an incredibly brilliant, incredibly stupid, powerful people pleaser that can be wonderful and can also not be. There always has to be a human in the loop. So, what a recent use I had for an AI was. My wife and I were going to be in Flushing, New York, and we wanted to go to different Chinese restaurants before going to a Mets game in Citi Field. So I asked an AI to please find 8 restaurants with high ratings in Flushing, New York, that were from different regions of China, describe what their food was like, and give us links to the reviews. Out it came. We ended up having 3 of the best snacks we've ever had in our life.
So informationally, that sort of information can be incredibly useful. It's been around for actually a long time, and it can be incredibly useful. I actually recently, Google now, if you Google something, right, AI comes up first, right? An AI consolidation of whatever it thinks is best comes up first. And I recently typed in, out of curiosity, what it would say. People we're in sort of a short days right now, short light. A lot of people are experiencing more anxiety at the end of the day, with the days being shorter. And sort of what should one do? Obviously, I know I offer often publicly what should one do, but I was curious, what would it say? We were going to have this conversation. Like, what would it say from an AI perspective one should do? And it actually said, so when you start to have those anxious thoughts in the evening, just say stop, and repeat stop, and say it very loudly, stop. And I was like, this is horrifying to me. This is actually like
Gail,
the opposite of what you should do.
You're illustrating how not to use AI.
Okay.
It is trivially simple to make an AI look stupid. It is trivially simple to make an AI look bad.
Okay.
That's not the issue. If you're really looking for that, you should go to an actual use GPT in search mode, or use something called perplexity.ai, which is an AI that uses the OpenAI LLM, but does it as a web searcher. And ask for multiple answers. And AI is different than every other computer thing we've ever used in 2 very important ways. One, you can give it the same instruction over and over and get radically different responses. No matter how many times you put 2 + 2 into a calculator, you're going to get 4. But you do that with AI and you're going to get 50 million different responses. The other thing is that AI is incredibly response promiscuous. So never ask just for one response, ask for 10.
Mhm.
And then pick the one that's best, because you always got to be the human in the loop.
So the human has to have some sense of what's best. Which I'm just pointing out in terms of psychoanalytic care or even our profession. Um, this is so seductive and yet often, as you're saying, incorrect. And how do you professionally? So you have super educated yourself, right? Super educated yourself. So okay, but I'm just saying, like you're able to have those many responses and go, I like this one, or I think this one makes sense, or this one sounds wrong to me. Um, but the public at large is Googling it,
Oh yeah,
and they're
absolutely.
getting the wrong answer.
Absolutely. But I think that's the result of corporate greed, not
Mhm.
AI technology. Um, and I think we have to be clear in our minds between using AI for human needs and human purposes, and using AI for corporate purposes, militarized purposes, and oligarchic purposes. One way, just professionally,
Yes.
that I've been using it, a couple of ways. I find it invaluable in creating lecture notes for a class. It saves me hours.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, 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 I've also embarked on a book project that I have absolutely not enough time to do. So I am trying to kind of fit it into 20 minutes here, a half hour here. Um, and I've made a custom GPT to be a writing coach, accountability partner, who actually, after I described the project and I gave the proposal and all this kind of stuff, said, you need to come up with, short 15-minute to 30-minute tasks that can be done in sequence so that I can kind of get this thing done. And I update it each time, and it's been very, very helpful in helping me stay organized and get focused. Um, so that's an example of where I'm using it in a way I think is productive.
So it can be your assistant, but you're still the author, and you have to check its
Apps,
work. You have to guide it. You have to.
100%, 100%. There's always got to be a human in the loop.
So you have embarked on this huge task, that hopefully other analysts will be, are joining in. And really what I think you're telling us is how important it is that analysts take the healthcare position, the ethical position, because psychoanalysis rides both those tracks, right? It's a medium of healthcare. It's also a commenter on and potential guide for the pitfalls and ethical dilemmas and moral necessities of society and human to human interaction. And that we as analysts are really important in this conversation of how are we going to prevent this from being misused. And I thought I liked your social media analogy was a great one. We took the genie out of the bottle with no guardrails and no advice at all. And, we're seeing, not to say that there aren't good things,
Yep.
not to say that there aren't good things, but that we are seeing a lot of the terrible dangers, and that we seem to, because it's already so far out of the bottle, we really have no way of putting it back. And you're sort of analogously saying, well, we have an opportunity early, wish it were earlier, but somewhat early in the development to really try at least to prevent those dangers.
So I think analysts need to be part of the AI revolution in order for our point of view to be taken seriously. And there are many reasons to do this. That we have to be kind of fully engaged and participants within the AI revolution for clinical reasons. Our patients are going to have increasing experience with and problems with AI. And if we're not part of the world that they're part of, we won't be able to help them. There are utilitarian reasons, in that if we don't use AI, we're not going to have the efficiencies, either in organizations or in education, to actually participate.
Mhm.
There are epistemological reasons. If we don't use the things, if we don't have procedural knowledge, we're not really going to be able to have grounded, reflective, critical perspectives. Um, and the big one, I think, is fear. This is an anxious kind of change. Um, and like, looking under the bed to see if the boogeyman is there, um, you kind of have to do that. And if you actually use AI in a productive way, in the way that, like I was trying to suggest about always being the human in the loop, not taking it too seriously, asking for multiple responses, using it frequently, trying to find ways to make it work, um, then we'll look under the bed to see that the boogeyman is there and finally be able to see the dirty socks and the dust bunnies. So I think fear is a real reason to motivate us to kind of not avoid it and ostrich ourselves,
Right.
um, but to really participate, but not as lemmings,
Right.
um, but to kind
Because
of
there
keep.
is reasonable fear. There are reasonable
Absolutely.
concerns. There are things to be,
Huge.
and this isn't the solution for all that I think, as you've pointed out, corporations would like it to be because it can generate income. But, as a solution, for example, to loneliness, I think that the jury's really out on that. Like these aren't humans, they are robots. Can this really solve our public health loneliness crisis? I
And I
think,
just read a study which looked at AI use among college students, and it reduced loneliness. But again, it also increased time spent alone and away from other people. It's a pharmacon, it's remedy and poison.
we as psychoanalysts really do need to weigh on when something might offer a short-term help response. Like in this case, you're saying it may be that a study shows, in the moment, in the day, in the week,
Yep.
that it might make someone feel less lonely, but that in the long term, it's actually more isolating, because you're even less likely to be interacting with another human that could sustain you and be really the antidote to loneliness, which is, actual intimate relationships. And so it may actually serve to be in a way more harmful in the long term for that college student. We don't know yet. Of course, by research, we don't know yet. But much like CBT is really excellent for some very short term, problem, fix, help. It may not be for longer term in the way that psychoanalysis, for example, is a longer term character structure, unconscious conflict, long-term patterns of behavior and relating and so on.
I agree with what you're saying 100% about the difference between the short term, dopamine jolt versus something which is more enduring, and that talking with an AI, even if it might temporarily reduce loneliness, is not going to be a substitute for being in a loving, kind, tender relationship over time, which is really what people need to have in their life. And there's another dimension to this of there being different kinds of short-term kinds of solutions. That on the one side, you're using the CBT example, which is terrific. And if an AI could provide that, that would be great. But there's also the possibility that what it's providing would be more akin to a substance abuse issue, where there's a temporary wonderful feeling, but there's even a short-term destructive effect, not just the absence of a positive effect. So these are the kinds of things that we need to kind of pay attention to. And we're not going to be able to pay attention to them if if we take as a model for AI interaction, Gail, your experience with Google and afternoon anxiety. We can only really get into this if we push the limits of what we understand an AI can actually do, because then we'll be able to discover what it can't.
Fascinating. Todd Essig, thank you so much for joining me today and illuminating all of us about this ever present issue and a hopeful future for psychoanalyst involvement in the development of this. I so appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you for listening in today. We, the American Psychoanalytic Association, hope to introduce you to the many ways psychoanalytic thought affects the world around us, and especially you, through this podcast. We would love to hear your thoughts, questions, and requests. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Follow APSA on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or X at psychoanalysis_ with the hashtag APSA podcast. And feel free to send a question or comment. You can find more information about the American Psychoanalytic Association by going to www.apsa.org and listen to more episodes and find bios of our guests online at apsa.org/podcast. If you found this episode useful, please share with a friend or colleague. And we will be back next month with another episode of Psychoanalysis and You. I'm Dr. Gail Saltz, and it's been my pleasure to be your host of Psychoanalysis and You. And now for some Freudian quickies. You sent in your questions for an analyst. I grabbed an analyst with an answer. Till next time.
Why do many analysts have an analytic couch? And what are analytic couches like if we do?
Analytic couches need to be comfortable and create an atmosphere where people feel like they can say whatever they want. People have to be vulnerable when they're in these conversations, and couch allows you to be open.
Analysts have analytic couches for at least three reasons. One is history. Freud had a couch, and we connect ourselves with that symbol of the beginning of analysis. Another one is identity. It sort of feels like you're not quite an analyst unless you have a couch. My first analytic supervisor suggested that I was ambivalent about being an analyst since I couldn't afford a couch yet and didn't have one. But probably the main reason is that it's a very important and useful tool to be able to free one's vision from the analyst. Allows the patient to go more deeply inward and look more clearly at their own internal world without having to gauge it against the analyst's reaction. Our couches say a lot about us. We think as analysts that we are blank slates. We're not. We are always showing who we are. And our couches are as individual analysts are. Some couches are very classical and draped with rugs like Freud. Some are very modern and clean with absolutely nothing on them, sort of that mid-century style modern. And some are like a living room couch where people can lie down or have family meetings or just be cozy.
Analysts have an analytic couch in order to allow our patients to relax and free associate without having to be burdened by ordinary social obligations, such as eye contact and managing facial expressions and so on. But really, many analysts don't have an analytic couch and work face-to-face. And if we do have an analytic couch, they can come in a variety of different sizes, shapes, colors, and so on. They're just as varied as there are analysts.